We have these supply chains, they're weakened. We have a healthcare system that sucks. We have infrastructure that's horrible. We have an international situation where workers around the world don't have access to the vaccine, and so they're getting sick. And then we have geopolitical volatility because oil is still our energy source. Just thinking about money being the problem because there's too much of it when you consider all of these dynamics is like a joke. We need to better use our resources and maybe build them up a bit, improve our infrastructure, invest in full employment, invest in a better healthcare system so that when there are shocks, we can maintain people's stability, and do all of these things under the guiding principle of quality of life.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, CUNY lecturer and Executive Director of Public Money Action, Andrés Bernal. And in a moment, we're going to be talking to him about how understanding modern money matters immensely for getting us off the collision course with Armageddon that Orthodox economic thinking has put us on. In this episode, we talk about the myth of barter, which is the idea that in some imagined time before money was invented, people trucked and bartered and exchanged things because these are innate human tendencies, according to a guy writing in 1776. And as you can imagine, that's all pretty inconvenient without money, so we must have invented money to make life easier. But the consensus among anthropologists and archaeologists is that this imagined past is not supported by any evidence, which is not to say that humans don't barter and exchange and truck. I mean, who doesn't love a good truck? But rather that the idea that money as we know it today evolved out of barter is not supported by experts for the most part. Probably the barter story persists because it feels intuitively plausible, and intuition is all we have to work with because, as primary MMT academic L. Randall Wray puts it, nobody sat down and wrote, "Today I invented money, and here's how I did it." So we have to speculate, and when we do that, we tend to imagine the world as it is at the moment, but with money taken out of it. So that's a world of people trying to negotiate prices and trade with each other, but without an agreed upon measure of value. And that's about as likely to work as a Kardashian. So to make it work, the easiest thing to do in our imaginations is to restore the missing piece of the puzzle. And that piece of the puzzle, because we just took it out and looked at it, is inevitably money-shaped. But there is a different origin story that does fit with what we know about money as it functions today. And so you'll hear us talk about Warren Mosler's business card analogy for describing chartalism. And that's the idea that the state chooses what is and isn't money, as states and authorities have been doing for at least 4,000 years, to paraphrase John Maynard Keynes. The state chooses and names a unit of account. Here in the UK, it's called the British pound, and the government creates demand for its currency by imposing tax obligations denominated in that unit of account, which means that people now have to do something to earn the state's currency, and that enables the government to spend its otherwise worthless pieces of paper, or more accurately, entries on a spreadsheet, into existence to hire those people to provision some ideally democratically decided public purpose. To bring this story to life, MMT founder Warren Mosler gives presentations where he attempts to hire his audience to clean the room they're in by offering to pay them with his business cards. Of course, in the first instance, nobody wants to work for business cards, so he then asks the audience to imagine that there's a tax collector with immutable authority at the door who will only accept Warren's business cards in payment for permission to leave the room. Now the audience need to do things to earn Warren's business cards, which enables him to spend as many as he needs, to hire as much labor as he needs, to provision the public purpose, which, in this example, is a clean room. Warren calls this turning litter into money. And this story underscores a couple of things. One, it tells us why we use our state-issued currencies for transactions rather than seashells or monkey JPEGs, because it gets to the heart of what fiat currency actually is. It's a tax credit. It's a promise to pay off a certain quantity of your tax obligation to the state, measured in pounds here in the UK, dollars in the US, and so on. Everybody needs to pay taxes, and so in the words of Danny DeVito in Heist, everybody needs money. That's why they call it money. The second point is that when he introduces his tax, in the first instance, Warren, standing in for the government, creates a huge problem for his audience, standing in for the private sector, namely 100% mass unemployment. As soon as he imposes his tax, every audience member is looking for work that pays in the room's currency but can't find it. And that's how we define unemployment. People looking to work for the state's currency who can't yet find it. And that's what's missing from our conversations about unemployment, the actual source of it. And that from the government's point of view, the point of creating this problem is to solve it by spending into the monetary vacuum deliberately created by the imposition of taxes to hire people to provision the public purpose. It makes no sense to levy taxes on a population and then not spend enough currency to give a job to everybody who wants one. And yet here we are in our so-called advanced economies with millions of people who want to work and work that needs doing, and governments with infinite spending power pretending the only thing they can do in this predicament is change interest rates and hope for the best. In a simplified model like Warren's classroom, the fix is obvious. You can either spend more cards or lower the tax until everybody who wants to work has a job. But in real economies, it's impossible to target a precise number of pounds or dollars or yen that will bring about true full employment. So MMT economists propose that the government, the issuer of currency, should act as an employer of last resort, which it already kind of does. It's just the job on offer is to stay home and have a miserable life trying to live on a below subsistence wage to fight inflation. In the UK, this job is also known as being on universal credit. Now, I'm not an infinitely wise market, but I can't help thinking that giving people who want a job an actual job is better. For more on how that would work, you can listen to our episodes 4 and 47. And also, I'm very excited to announce that the Modern Money Network are hosting the 4th annual MMT conference online over all the weekend evenings of April this year, starting this Friday, the 8th of April, with a panel on MMT content production and publication, which Patricia and I will be part of, and that kicks off at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And here's the fun part, that's 12:30 a.m. on Saturday morning for anybody in the UK who wants to tune in live, but it's also going to be recorded if you prefer to watch it when you're sober. I've linked to where you can register for all of the month's events in the show notes for this episode, along with some other things that came up in the following conversation. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep this show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's truck. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we're delighted to welcome back scholar, researcher, CUNY lecturer, and executive director of Public Money Action, Andrés Bernal. Hi, Andrés.
Hey, thank you so much for having me back. You know, it's so interesting because the first time I was here with you all was kind of at the beginning of my journey into MMT.
Yeah,
and,
it was a while back, wasn't it?
It was a while back, and so many stories, so many adventures have happened since then.
So we wanted to talk about your most recent paper published via the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and that paper is entitled Inflationary Pressures in the Time of COVID-19, MMT as a Theory of Inflation. And in that paper, you write, quote, according to the Orthodox lens, when the government spends, it is supposed to mechanistically drive inflationary pressures up just as gravity pulls objects towards each other, unquote. And then you write, quote, to unpack why this view is wrong, we have to look at what orthodox economists misunderstand about money in the first place. So, Andrés, could you lay that out for us, what orthodox economists misunderstand about money?
Yeah. So, one of my interests in how I approach MMT as a school of heterodox economic thought, as a school of policy, as a movement, is to, search for the underlying assumptions that kind of structure the different theories, both from an MMT perspective and then also compared to the orthodoxy. And something that's very apparent to me and that I was working on before I was even introduced to MMT formally was kind of this impulse in orthodox economics to try to emulate physics and try to see the world of economies as a bunch of forces that are independent of governance, and they're just kind of crashing into each other. And we respond to those forces that are natural, and they ground the very essence of who we are. So when speaking to the misunderstanding that they have about money and thus about inflation, one of the things I mentioned in the paper is their view of prices as something that is driven by supply and demand as these kind of natural gravitational forces that are premised on the barter story of money. And right, so it's this idea that in the beginning, right, there was barter, and human beings kind of popped into the world, and the first thing that they did, just on instinct, was to trade. Right? All that culture and authority and meaning and rules, that's all secondary, right? Our kind of first impulse was just, let's trade. And from that, right, you have this notion that the world is structured by methodological individualism, and every person is this rational agent that is just in the world to seek its self-interest. And we know kind of that story from how the orthodoxy thinks markets work, and obviously by extension how they think prices and money works. And so obviously there's this other assumption that things have value when there is a utility to them, but that is premised on this notion of scarcity that is shaping how people understand what has utility to them. It's kind of this free-for-all in a scarce world, but with unlimited wants and desires. So, we see the picture being painted already of the human species as just being like radically self-interested, trying to consume and extract and see how they can get a leg up in the world as individuals, but encountering a scarce world. And so the only way to organize ourselves successfully is to trade. And so because of that, what money is and how it has value through prices as this universal equivalent and whatnot is this extension of minimizing transaction costs, as they say, to barter, because you can end up in a situation where the coincidence of wants doesn't appear as straightforward, in the sense that like I want something, the other person wants something, and that could lead to an easy exchange or trade. But sometimes that isn't a one-to-one coincidence, and money makes that possible. So of course, if you introduce too much of it, it disrupts the purity of that process. It intervenes. Who would do such a thing of introducing all of this new money? It has to be these evil authorities that are trying to disrupt that beautiful divine process of perfectly equilibrated market exchanges. And so when they do that, of course, you start to dilute. It's not first and foremost a moral thing. It's a natural thing. You have some folks like Mises and Hayek and that those kind of historically important neoliberal thinkers who really saw these markets, these natural markets, these fundamentals as the core essence of human nature. It brings about the very structure of consciousness and language to them. that's the story, right? So, these are natural forces, and if we introduce too much money, it disrupts this process. And so, even some of the self-described, more center-left economists in the modern world, even kind of self-described Keynesians, new Keynesians or whatnot, Krugman and some of these other folks, they might distinguish themselves from the monetarists. But at the end of the day, a lot of what they believe is still being shaped by these views, these fundamental implicit assumptions about the world.
You mentioned something that actually quite hit the nail on the head for me, and that was that they view these kind of forces that sets prices as natural. And they imply that there is a degree of justice in the way that prices function and demand and supply functions. And I find it a little bit contradictory, their position sometimes, because as part of this pandemic and the prices rises that have happened, our Bank of England governor at the moment, Andrew Bailey, wasn't shy in asking workers not to ask for pay rises, for example, but he didn't ask bosses not to ask for more profits. So on the one hand, the profit seeking is a natural process and fair, whereas the wage side of things, if inflation is caused by wages, then that's seen as you say, unnatural, kind of a distorting or even a perverse thing to happen. What would you say about that dichotomy? Because it really confuses me sometimes.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Patricia, because I love kind of breaking that down and thinking about that. And I've spent some time looking through the history of contemporary economic thought to try to find answers to that as well, because I think it is very confusing to a lot of folks. And one thing that I think you see in the literature is that through this process of what we could call neoliberalism, which I think sometimes there's some misunderstanding about what is meant by that. And some people argue that that's not even a real coherent label or category. And through work of people like Philip Murawski, who wrote and has written very fascinating stories of the evolution of specifically neoliberal thinkers as these groups of individuals, business elites, philosophers, economists, who formed these institutions and organizations as a response to the New Deal, World War II, and this kind of rise of embedded liberalism, as sometimes it's called, or social democracy or welfare states, et cetera. They were very afraid that this was going to change the future of society and politics. So they started to theorize and try to find ways to provide an alternative to this. And I think one of the important distinctions that the neoliberal thought collective, as it's sometimes called, has to neoclassical thinking or the kind of free market tropes is that they morally see markets as natural, but not always forming naturally. So that's kind of a contradiction just in thinking about that, right? So they think, markets and this process that I described earlier is the superior form of human relationality. But they understand that it can be common for this to break down if it's not fostered correctly. And as their thinking evolves into the 70s and 80s and beyond, they really see that the hierarchy and the inequality that forms in society is good because it is kind of reflecting that competition that is giving authority and more power to market forces, which in their views are so much more intelligent than as they would see it. I think like dumb humans. It's really markets that in competition that is much more moral and rational than just like humans on their own. So this is all to say that when the rubber hits the road, the neoliberal will support the state, even through military violence or through policies, as you just mentioned, that protect kind of corporate entities, to intervene and ensure that this competition isn't disrupted by, horrible things like democracy or human ethics. God forbid. That'd be terrible. And there's interesting debates in kind of this neoliberal space because some folks, I'm thinking specifically of the Ordo liberals in Germany, they're like, okay, well, we need some welfare state, but not because it's good, not because people deserve rights, not because it's just, But because if we don't have some basic welfare state, then these kind of people will not, or people in general will not be able to participate in the market. So, a lot of welfare policies to neoliberals are only justified so that people can become consumers and know their place and go out and shop. But if they demand too much, if workers demand too much, you need technocrats, authority figures, governments, et cetera, to step in and be like, whoa, hey, all right, that's enough. It's enough democracy for you people. We got to get back to order here.
On that topic, you quote our friend Scott Ferguson, who you work with as part of the Money on the Left collective. He points out, and I'm paraphrasing, but he points out that the scarcity mindset and the zero-sum politics derived from it are a recipe for perpetual neoliberalism, if not outright fascism. Could you say more about that?
Yes. So another thing that has really interested me is to explore this debate that sometimes exists even within MMT thought about, is MMT, purely descriptive and not political, or is it inherently political and prescriptive? And, the position I usually take is that it's both, but with the caveat that any social science and all economics is inherently normative practice and political. Because, we're talking about institutions that make decisions, anything from markets to banks to income to employment. These are all normative social decisions that are really important to consider. Part, I think, of the power of the orthodoxy and of neoliberalism is to convince the public that actually, no, it's not. This is just the way things are, right? Like, we can talk about democracy all day and justice all day, but at the end of the day, we have hard limits on economic forces, and there's nothing we can do about it. And so a big part of this is that zero-sum framework, that the only way then to accomplish something, to perhaps invest in public schools, to perhaps give more people healthcare, to invest in renewable energy in the middle of a climate ecological catastrophe. The only way to do any of that is to take it from somewhere else. So in that sense, it's kind of contracted, right? You can't world build without kind of destroying another place. Now, I think the left has responded well intentionally by saying, okay, well, that means kind of direct class war against capitalists, and I have no problem with that. I think we need to struggle against these absolutely unfair and obscene inequalities. However, with that said, when it comes to money politics and investment, what we often see is somebody makes the argument that, well, the numbers don't add up, right? You want a Green New Deal, you want to tax the rich, fine. The numbers don't add up. And so immediately the response is like, okay, well, I guess we got to tax the middle class. I guess we got to tax the working class. And that's when historically this descends into a politics of, what us at Money on the Left will call kind of zero-sum thinking that's very rooted in racist and classist and, sexist and all of these kind of cultural politics that will tell the taxpayer, right? And there's a whole politics to the construction of that identity, who we are and how we see ourselves as taxpayers, that tell the taxpayer, you are going to pay, your work is going to pay for this other family to have something else. And when we see that historically, those taxpayers tend to be already wealthier, in the United States, whiter, the authority figures in households, which tend to be men, all of this kind of politics that was constructed by policies and credit and the creation of the suburbs and segregation and all of this like very explicit politics, right? And so then you in the US you have this story of the civil rights movement, which challenges a lot of these things, where there's an open movement for a job guarantee and full employment, where people are trying to go back to the unfinished work of Reconstruction and the ending of slavery. And the Civil Rights Act is passed. And there are some gains made on how easy it is for kind of American apartheid to exist and open, explicit racism to exist. So a lot of segregationists immediately went into economics. And this is something that's not really thought about as much. They went into economics. They went into Austrian economics. They went into kind of the monetarism, because it becomes coded language to argue on taxpayer money. There's no money for this. Political categories like welfare queens in the United States emerges, where people in the public start to see each other as enemies and histories of racial supremacy and whatnot are fostered, so that it's the zero-sum competition over who's more deserving of public money and investment. And so that's kind of like been a very effective political weapon in both perpetuating neoliberalism and sometimes leading to all-out fascism. When the neoliberal market fetishism doesn't work, as I mentioned before, you need the state to step in. And when the state steps in, it doesn't step in a vacuum from all of these kind of cultural, racial politics as well. And so this manifests in the form of very fascist impulses. So that's that kind of story. And it's a prison. It's a cultural, ideological prison that we can't get out of, right? So we end up having these debates about like, well, we have to choose either labor organizing and class politics or, racial justice and racial equity and gender politics. Pick one, because there's not enough money and there's not enough energy for any of these, right? And so much of this comes back down to zero-sum finite money theories that are informing and shaping this whole process. So when we, and this I guess transitions into how MMT is different, right? When we see money as this boundless public utility that's constrained by resources and the institutions that designate, that name, and that give meaning to resources, which is something else I discussed in the paper, which is that resources aren't, they become. We have to choose what we understand resources to do and to be. We have to choose why something is a resource and what we want to do with it. And that's all political and it's all normative. So all of a sudden, our policy and economic consciousness opens itself up to, it's not zero sum. It's more, in a way, kind of creative. It's world building. It's trying to rethink and reimagine how we can coexist in ways that address these different needs that aren't always just dichotomies or oppositions. We can kind of transvalue or restructure. We can do two things at once with public money. The impact that public money has on culture and media, for example, right? The narratives, the ideas that shape our understanding of ourselves and each other. Where do those come from? Well, they come from institutions that rely on public money, schools, community groups, public media. And we're lacking in so much of that today. And so all we have is kind of this all-out cultural war, and also manifesting in very material ways as well. So, when you have public money, you can invest in changing perceptions. You can invest in changing aesthetic experience. You can invest in changing how we value work and what work is. And that goes right into the job guarantee, right? So that's kind of how I think of that, and the work that humanities and philosophers, social theorists that are kind of in the money on the left space, our contribution to the general MMT work.
I had a comment about something you said a bit earlier, and it's more of a comment, and I'm just wanting to bounce that off you and see what you think of it. This idea of that economic theories are normative necessarily. When I completed the mainstream economics course, one of my first books that I had to read was one by Mankiw, which is a very popular textbook used in all universities, and it was on macroeconomics, and I believe it was the third page of the first chapter that said, history has proven communism is bad. Markets are the best, most fair way to distribute resources. That seemed pretty normative to me very, very early on in the process, before they had even explained to me what markets were or anything. And one of the things, I guess, that attracted me to MMT, and one of the discussions we were having here with Warren a while back, was that Warren had a chat with an Austrian economist. I don't know if you've seen it. It's all over YouTube.
Mm-hmm. I have. The Bob Murphy debate.
And in it, he uses his metaphor about, the explaining taxes and explaining it with a man and standing with a gun and being the tax man. And I remember the Austrian guy saying, Warren wants, a man to shoot you with a gun. And the funny thing is, of course, Warren isn't saying, this is the best system in the way that Mankiw was saying it. Warren was saying, this is how things work. Don't shoot the messenger, And so what I liked, one of the things that I really liked about MMT was that it was simply stating how things work. It wasn't making any assertions as to whether that was good or bad. But also by explaining how things worked and why things worked in a certain way, it also allowed you to imagine a different scenario where things didn't work that way. What if we were to move beyond money? These very long-term goals, of course, and things like that. And so I found MMT to be far less normative, let's say, than the mainstream economics would be. Would you agree with that?
I don't know. And one of the reasons I love MMT is that it opens up these really important philosophical questions about society and economic thinking that we haven't seen since the late 19th century, early 20th century, where we were having similar debates about, well, what is the purpose of society and how can we do things to improve the hellish, brutal conditions of industrialization, colonization, and all these sorts of things. Those debates were deeply philosophical. And I think mainstream economics has done away with a lot of that. It's not that those questions aren't there. It's that the way that knowledge is taught and distributed, as you mentioned, in Mankiw's argument that history has proven that this has failed and markets win, I think that the argument is making is that it's because this is the natural way the world works. You can't change human nature. You can't overcome these laws of supply and demand, right? If you do so, you can only do so through authoritarianism, and that devolves into madness, right? And so therefore, there is no alternative. And I think that that's really where Margaret Thatcher and that tradition, and Reagan and that kind of tradition get that idea, right? We can do nothing because this is the best way. We have discovered the way societies function. It is through markets. Social democrats and all these kind of center-left parties must accept these principles. And if we were to do anything against them, it would devolve into, Stalinism. That's already just such a nonsense dichotomy to even give us, right? A way of even thinking about the problem. So I think that in saying like, okay, MMT is telling us this is the way the world works. Just from a kind of like a philosophical perspective, for anybody to look at that world and its accuracy, right? Because I do agree that there is this descriptive level to MMT, of course, right? And that's very important because it more accurately describes the world than these other theories. And then we see that, I think, just by seeing, because we're human beings, right? Because we're socially embedded, interdependent creatures. We can't just see the world and not have a normative position, right? Like we're not zombies. I mean, can we look at the world as it is right now and see unemployment or the relationship between military spending and kids that can't even afford decent books, or teachers that don't have supplies and are at the edge of a mental breakdown? Like, if we see that, we take a position, and that position says a lot about who we are. And so I think that's where I'm coming from, that yes, we are describing the world more accurately, but also in doing so, then questions open up to us. To your other point, which I think is so important and critical, about Mosler's kind of commentary on, okay, we're in a room, and if there was people with guns enforcing the tax obligation, therefore the Mosler business cards would have the value of an important currency, right? We all know that example. This brings up, I think, very interesting debates that are happening in MMT, especially as it relates to Marxists and other radical and critical thinkers who say, look, MMTers are just describing this oppressive state-centric system where there can only be tax obligations through colonialism, through imperialism, through militarism. Some of the work that I think is really interesting coming out of the Money on the Left collective is to say, look, what we see going back in history and on this story of money is that debts, credit, and obligation are always there. They're part of who we are. They structure our interdependence. They mediate and shape our contributions to humanity, to our society, to the polity that we belong to. They don't go away. And so therefore, yes, the way the state enforces tax obligations can be and has been incredibly violent. But that is not, by definition, a requirement to the very notion of obligations. And the very notion of participation, right? Because, the sense of like, you have to give something back, right? You have to be taxed. And that, of course, is tied into this much larger legal system about who accepts payment for fees, who accepts payments for contract resolutions, who accepts payment for fines, whatever. I think there is a case to be made about both using the insights of MMT as it exists today, where we can spend and the taxation is the way it is, and also continuing to improve, restructure, reimagine what something like a state can be to move away from inherent violence as the only way to organize responsibility, obligation, debt, and credit.
I do think that when Warren talks about the guy with the gun giving the thing value, people who go take that, you see the MMT is, just want militarism.
Right.
It's like, do you understand why people tell stories? Do you know what an analogy is? Right. Do you know what I mean? The guy with the gun is not a literal guy with a gun going, give me a Warren Mosler business card or I will shoot you.
Right.
The guy with the gun is representing, the law. All right.
Yes. Yes.
Try not paying your taxes for long enough. You will suffer some negative consequences. It won't be getting mowed down by somebody with an Uzi,
by a fanatic Mosler follower.
Yeah, exactly. I find that I can't take people seriously when they don't get that that's a metaphor.
Right.
I think you have to deliberately, you have to interpret that in a very silly way to not get that that's a metaphor.
Yeah.
I do think that, Andrés is raising a really important point. And one of the kind of philosophical discussions that MMT arises is, just going on from the Warren analogy, he's talking about violence, right? But I think we can distinguish between exercised violence and violence that everybody's outraged by, an attack on the street, invasion of a country or something like that.
I don't think he's talking about violence. I think he's saying force. Law has force, right?
It is, yeah, but it is the same thing because I think that much of the force and our relationship with the government, much of the example that Warren is giving, it may not be violence like I may not be beaten up by the government, but I'll do as they tell me because there is a threat of violence or an implied threat of violence. I know that I ultimately cannot get away with it, and I've come to kind of appreciate that threat of violence hangs over many of society's relationships, and but that's different from saying, from the violence of invading a country or beating somebody up or worse. It's something that we can't see, but it's always there.
True. I see what you're saying, but I get it. I guess it. Okay. Sorry. This whole episode is going to be about this business card thing.
Cut it out.
No. All I'm saying is, right. He holds up the business card. He says, "I'm going to take out my business card. And would anybody like to work for this?" And nobody does, obviously. Then he goes, "Okay, there's a guy with a gun and you need to pay him to get out of the room," right? When he holds up the business card, everybody gets that he's saying, "I'm turning this into money." Everybody gets that that's metaphorical. Then when he says, "There isn't really a guy with a gun, it's just pretend, but imagine there was one." And then he says, "The guy with the gun is the tax man." I think if you understand the business card is meant to be money, and he explicitly says the guy with the gun is meant to be the tax man, the reason that he does it is because it's like, yeah, obviously it shocks the senses. Oh yeah, God, imagine if there was a man with a machine gun at the door. And that's the point of metaphors.
Maybe Andrés can settle this.
Yeah, I mean, I do think Patricia's point is really important because, and we get this argument all the time from other anthropologists or social scientists who kind of say, like, is money inherently premised on force and on a violent state? The point of that analogy and that metaphor is that you need to create demand for a currency. And historically, the way we create demand for a currency is through the state and law. And historically, the way we enforce the state and law is through force, and in many, many, many occasions, violence. So some people say, well, therefore, MMT only works in an imperialist context, right? And our point is to say that social obligation, debts, law, the things that structure participation in an inherently interdependent world does not have to be like, there is no ontological requirement that has to be explicitly violent. That doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to imagine responsibility and obligation and even justice or a justice system outside of the bounds of violence. I mean, I would already say that there are differences in, say, an authoritarian society's relationship with the state and violence and a more democratic one, right? So we can continue to work on that. I mean, and there's very interesting conversations that we have with, advocates for thinking about a world beyond policing and beyond prisons, right? How would restorative justice and kind of responding to things that are wrong and punishment, right? How do we rethink things if all of our needs are met? If we can greatly reduce the role of prisons and police, if we get to a point where that's no longer necessary to discipline populations, right? And we can think of other ways to do that. That has huge implications for what social responsibility and obligations are, how they're administered. So yes, whether it's that direct example of the exaggerated metaphor or thinking about a post-prison society, the purpose here, the question behind all of this is, how do we organize coordination, responsibility, and obligation? And so to take this back to the paper, inflation and price issues, and one of the things that I argue there is that prices don't just kind of bubble up from everybody participating in the market as the primordial fundamentals of reality, but rather there's all this coordination going on. There are firms that are in business groups, that are in industries, they have associations, they have boardrooms, they meet with each other, they coordinate with the government, with the state, they coordinate with local officials, they coordinate with one another. So they don't want necessarily like their competition to disrupt their businesses. And they set prices to cover the costs that they may be experiencing. And that's also political, because sometimes covering those costs means passing on the costs to workers or to consumers, aka price gouging, which is something we're seeing now, and that's part of the debate as well, right? We're seeing all of these corporations have increases in marginal profits, and yet we're still seeing prices go up. Okay, why? That is a decision that is being made. There have also been instances throughout this pandemic where some firms did not just kind of knee-jerk raise prices right away. There are other things to consider, like loyalty to their consumers, perceptions that they might have by the public. Since there's been kind of a blow up of fear and moral panic around inflation and prices, I think that many corporations have taken advantage of that panic to price gouge, because the public isn't being told the real story of how this is happening necessarily. You have Fox News and all of these in America, in the United States, all of kind of, and even some of the mainstream outlets that are like, all of this spending that came from the pandemic and the checks that they gave people and the child tax credit and all of these sorts of things, like that disrupted the money supply. That's the problem. And the only way we can respond to this is to raise interest rates and slow down the economy and discipline workers. And everybody's like, okay, just get my gas prices down again.
Yeah.
So we're not thinking about, all right, what is the state of supply chains? Or please explain to me how raising interest rates and forcing a recession is going to fix supply chains or stabilize fossil fuels.
This is a great place to throw in the quote from Rowan Gray that you put in your paper. He wrote recently on Twitter, "One way to deal with weeds in your garden is to bomb your house. That will get rid of the weeds for sure. But only a maniac would point to gardening by mortar as a good idea. But that's the logic of people who use Volcker to justify interest rate supremacy. You see, you MMT people, you just want to bomb people's gardens." That's what the person that doesn't get metaphors would be saying right now. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That our position as MMT people is, okay, we've got inflation. We have to look at the real sources of this inflation and, not just use monetary policy like Volcker did to make everybody poorer really quickly.
Yes. And of course, that disproportionately affects historically segregated and marginalized and brutalized groups. So once again, we're back at the normative from a seemingly innocuous political policy decision. And I think some of the developments in MMT world as of late has been, for example, at Public Money Action, we published a report called The New Monetary Policy, which is saying, all right, if we're not going to raise interest rates, if we recognize that that is absurd and just ridiculous, well, what can we do from a strictly monetary policy perspective and what the central bank can do? And in that report, Nathan Tankis explains how we should start thinking about regulating more strictly the financial system and credit issuance, right? Who gets access to credit from banks, which is, as we all know, primarily for profits, right? Are we just going to allow, somebody that wants to build another casino or a golf course or I don't know, right? Like these big luxurious projects. I think that we need to have some serious conversations about restricting some of that, restricting some of the lending that goes out to fossil fuel based gray industrial development and start to see that as complementary to productive fiscal policy or government spending that is going to increase our productive capacity, right? So we're back here on we have these supply chains, they're weakened. We have a healthcare system that sucks and it could not handle the pandemic shock. We have infrastructure that's horrible, and it's also contributing to these supply chains issues. We have an international situation where workers around the world don't have access to the vaccine, and so they're getting sick, and that's also hurting costs and leading to bottlenecks, shortages, et cetera, in supply chains as well. And then we have geopolitical volatility because oil is still our energy source, and this is causing all kinds of craziness these days, right? And I laugh because, we can't cry. So in that context, we can say, all right, well, just thinking about money being the problem because there's too much of it when you consider all of these institutional dynamics is like a joke. Like, what's wrong with people? We're supposed to be adults. How are these experts still out here talking about the world as if they're 15 years old and discovered Harry Potter for the first time? I don't understand. So we're supposed to have more sophisticated discourse about this. So, right, in the paper, I discuss how costs need to be deconstructed and unpacked. Where are the costs coming from, the increased costs? And think about how, okay, in some sense, maybe we do need to cut demand and what might that look like. But in another sense, we need to better use our resources and maybe build them up a bit, improve our infrastructure, invest in full employment so that we can handle more, invest in a better healthcare system. I know in the UK, it's getting privatized. Here in the United States, it's just awful. Increasing that healthcare system so that when there are shocks, we can respond appropriately. We can maintain people's stability and do all of these things under the guiding principle, I think, of quality of life. Because I think that is the true indicator. And we can discuss and debate about what that could mean, but that is the true indicator of a good society, not GDP. Not just let's just create shit for the sake of it. No, it's how are our people living? Are our people thriving? Are we creating? Are we imagining these better futures? And so that should be the guiding principle for things like fiscal policy, for things like monetary policy, for how we evaluate if we're being successful, for how we measure the limits of inflation, all of these sorts of things. And that's why in the paper, I bring up scholarship on accounting, which goes back to kind of more ancient times, the Middle Ages, and these other eras where accounting wasn't just this bland, way of measuring profits or how well you are doing in a market, but rather accounting was a mirror to give us some insight through record keeping and evaluation of decision making that we can think about in terms of what are we doing? And is this aligned with our values? Have these outcomes produce things that we want, right? It can contribute to democracy, accounting. Which is really what money is at the end of the day.
You just reminded me of L. Randall Wray's said a thing. The earliest writing that we know about was accounts.
Yes.
He makes a joke that I quite like where he says, writing wasn't invented by poets, it was invented by accountants.
Yes.
On the topic of messaging, in your paper, you reference a recent AOC interview, and you say that it was a clinic on how elected officials should be talking about inflation. Now, we often hear stories from people who have been with insiders who have said, yeah, so-and-so gets MMT, but when they take it to the boss goes, look, I can't say this in public, because the public consciousness is not quite ready to absorb it. For those of us who haven't seen AOC talking about inflation, could you summarize the talking points?
Yes. So Alexandria was on CNN's Don Lemon, and her response to, this fear about inflation and kind of the moral panic was to say that if we do not get the root cause of these price increases right, then policy decisions could be made that could really negative impact your life. She explains that price increases are confined to specific sectors dealing with reopening and supply chain bottlenecks. So AOC goes on to warn against just randomly, haphazardly raising interest rates, as we've discussed, which would drive up unemployment and maybe even worsen inflation, right? That's a very plausible risk as well. So in that sense, right, which is something that she does so incredibly well, which is sometimes breaking down complicated things in these like bite-sized pieces. I mean, I saw someone on Twitter the other day who was like, I've spent the last 3 years developing this theory, and AOC just tweeted it. So I mean, yeah, that's such a clinic in how to respond, right? It's like, okay, you got to be specific about where price increases are happening. They're confined to specific sectors. They're having structural issues. We cannot just respond to this by randomly, and irresponsibly shooting up interest rates. It will make things worse. It can hurt people, and it might even make prices increase more.
And really, some prices go up, and that gets called inflation as well. That's a problem, I think, that so many things get lumped under inflation. And inflation is the continuous rise of a price level over a period of time. Continuous.
Yes. Right.
It's not petrol went up quite sharply today. It could be over time. It could feed into a change in the price level.
Right.
And that takes us back to Warren's idea about it will become inflation if the market demands higher prices and the government ratifies that demand for higher prices by paying them.
Yes. It's again, just privileging these things we call markets as being prior to coordination, governance, mediation, etc.
Yeah, and I like the way that in your paper because everything's inflation now, asset price inflation, wood inflation, whatever. And you do a little bit of reframing in the paper where you say, we need a superior theory that explains inflation. But then you say, or rather price stability / instability. I like how the passage in itself is getting people to think about what inflation is.
I think that talking about price stability is a political tactic and also, again, more accurate to exactly what's going on. When we just throw around the word inflation, I think we risk shutting our imaginations down. I mean, something that I'm just really fascinated about, too, is the way that we frame these political debates collectively creates the boundaries for how we can discuss what's possible, what's not possible, and how people feel about it. And so much of our politics is about breaking through those limits or reforming them so that we can see things differently. That's very difficult when we just throw around the word inflation all the time. So I do think that if we talk about price stability and how to respond to destabilizations in prices, will help us get to that conversation about resources, I think, in a more effective way.
In the section where you talk about root causes of high prices and action that could be taken to ameliorate them, you talk about student and medical debt cancellation. And I know that some people in the debt collective have been talking MMT. There's a guy called Braxton Brewington, who is their press secretary, who was on an interview for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting on Counterspin last week. And he actually said, we use the MMT analysis when talking about economics. So I just wondered, are you guys in touch with those guys?
We're increasingly in touch, right? Like, all of these relationships, it kind of is a work in progress. And there's so many new groups and faces that we're encountering and building solidarity with. So we're increasingly more in contact with debt cancellation people in different countries and here in the US and whatnot, to in a lot of ways provide a macroeconomic background to what happens when you cancel medical and student debt and other kinds of debt, which is, of course, what we want. And we can resist a lot of these ridiculous arguments about putting the US, for example, deeper in the hole of debt. That's obviously the establishment response to that in many ways. And how it would be a huge boost to the economy. That is an opportunity to, again, start thinking about where do we want to take this thing? People try to frame this as like, MMTers and other progressives want to do planning and a planned economy versus the freedom of the market. But an understanding of history and how actually capitalism unfolded, evolved, industrialization, all of that. Again, there's just never been this situation of just these humans just trading and that's it, and everything else is secondary to that. No, we live in a planned economy. We've always have, but it's just planned in different ways and for different interests. And currently, our economy is planned for a class of elites that have tremendous control over resources and ownership and the culture that is part of that as well. So bringing back the notion of more democratically accountable decision-making and governance and planning is vital to this conversation as well.
I've always been like, well, obviously economies are planned. I've never bought into this idea of, well, the best way for us to organize the way we produce, distribute, and consume things is to have no plan.
Yeah, exactly. And I've recently been advising and working with a campaign in Denver, the Neil Walia for Congress campaign. And one thing we've been doing is developing some policy propositions for some of the smaller businesses and that kind of blue collar small business sector in Denver that is getting pushed out by big corporations and getting hit the hardest by kind of some of our economic problems. And, I've really kind of emphasized and prioritized the importance of reducing debt in the economy and improving wages as this kind of just obvious classic demand-based growth where, okay, what could be better for your mom and pop shop or your small business or whatever than actually people in the community not being burdened by insane amounts of debt, having some more disposable income and getting to shop local. That's such a big part of it as well.
Is that point of them on democracy that I think is so important? Probably the main antagonism I think that I find from the mainstream economics camp is that they see, economics as an optimization exercise, and anything that knocks the economy off that optimized path is bad for everybody. And that leads them to conclude that it's better to keep, lay people away from these very important decisions like running the economy. As you say, Andrés, that kind of mentality of seeing things as natural and separate from decisions of central government then kind of restricts the way that they appreciate possibilities within the economy.
Yeah, Scott Ferguson likes to say that he likes to say that the only ontological truth is interdependence, kind of on a social level, right? Like we're thrown into existence. I know I didn't consent to be thrown into existence, but here we are. We're here, right? We're here. And my point in saying that, right, is like it's hard. Existence is hard. We don't just come into being and do things on our own. We come into being and we're dependent on each other, all of us. And that's hard work. And that's, you got to grapple with that. But I think with that also comes the potential for flourishing and all this creativity and all of this like transformative capacity to make something of that reality, right? And I think with the climate crisis and some of the challenges we're facing now, we also see that interdependence isn't just amongst humans as, inherently superior to everything else, but rather embedded in these ecologies, and having to kind of concern and discern how we, move forward given this interdependence. And that's kind of why I am so committed to the idea that it's inherently normative and political, because we have to decide, how do we live? How do we coexist? And that is, I think, the fundamentals of politics, of institutions, of economics, of life, of social life.
So in terms of where do we go from here, at the end of your paper, you quote Stephanie Kelton, who wrote recently that the key to responsibly spending vast sums of money lies in carefully managing an economy's real productive limitations. What would a future look like where we're carefully managing our real limitations, or what might be some steps on the road to that future?
It's a $1 trillion question, right? So we have the $1 trillion coin for that. Yes. I think that, there are these multiple levels of politics that need to happen. And I often refer to this as all at once politics, right? So carefully managing resources in that formal policy sense means that some of these institutions in our government, in the United States, the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and many others who currently operate to reinforce and kind of produce the knowledge that is aligned with the orthodoxy. We kind of need to repurpose those to bring us knowledge that's different, that produces information that lets us know the state of our economy and the state of resources. And I often bring up how to do that most effectively, and I think most democratically, the obvious path is to align with the labor movement, not just because it's a good idea, because we should fight to uplift working people, but also because organized workers and labor unions are the best way to have the fullest understanding and data of our economy and how it functions. So having that kind of more direct dialogue and relationality with labor unions and a labor movement is very important, I think, to repurposing some of these institutions. Same can be said about climate groups and entering the process of how do we talk about and understand the ecological crisis. I think a lot of the growth versus degrowth debate has conceded too much to the completely socially constructed term called GDP. And even the word growth is a human invention that we're applying to mean specific things in the economy. But why would we advocate for a degrowth in hugs and in friendship and in knowledge, and just overall coolness or whatever, right? There's no need for that. So when we say growth, I think it's important to move away from our fixation on GDP and start to see growth as something that is qualitative, that is embedded and integrated into expanding, liberating, and fostering the human condition, that takes seriously the limits of ecological boundaries, but does not kind of also fall into, the trap of austerity, which I think historically there have been groups that see limits to kind of a Malthusianism that sees ecological limits as a reason for, as a reason to live austerely. That's, I think, not productive either. So because money is a legal artifact, because money is a public utility, because it's an accounting infrastructure, etc., I think that means that living sustainably and in a prosperous way is a qualitative project. And so, it's about gathering data in a better way, working with scientists in a way that's explicitly normative, right? Not necessarily political, because I think sometimes that could be misleading or confusing, but scientists are not in a vacuum just producing knowledge. They're, let's give us information about the state of the world. Make that something that's accessible to the public, right? The public is so disconnected from your average scientists because our education system has been so privatized, because college is unaffordable, because communities are kind of abandoned and marginalized and excluded from these processes of who gets to be a professional and who gets to be a scientist. And that's so toxic, right? And that, of course, leads to, I think, the other part of this equation for me, which is shifting the culture. And that is so tied to education that I think has oftentimes been ignored in conversations of economics and left politics, not in the sense of follow authority and let's plug you into a company or let's make you the ideal worker for a corporation, but rather returning to this question of public education as civic development and what it means to live a life of lifelong learning and curiosity and reflection and community building, right? And in integrating science and knowledge, social science, different epistemologies, if you will, into that process, that's a big part of changing culture. I think media, bringing back a political debate about public media, about projects that invest in perhaps community managed or nonprofit managed and administered public media that is independent from the state but receives funding from public authorities to do things different from the way it is now, which is become this kind of unhealthy spectacle, although not all spectacle is bad necessarily, but it's kind of become very limited to private interests and things like this, right? So bringing back this conversation about public interest media, because these are the narratives that shape our lives, right? And there's so many stories. So, one example I often think about is the way the country here in the US thinks about the border, the way politicians have scared people into seeing the border as this horrible place that's getting invaded by these immigrants and all that xenophobia, right? It's kind of being reproduced all the time by people in media and politicians, right? But there's so many fascinating stories from people from the border that we just don't have, the rest of the country doesn't have access to. And so what would it mean to provide public funds to these people, these communities, to get the opportunity to make these stories into pieces of art that can be shared with the world and with the rest of the country, right? This is also how we shift the culture and how we shift our understanding of one another.
Before we wrap up, can you tell the listeners what you've got coming up in terms of events and publications and so on and so forth?
Yeah, so I've been working on something about MMT as applied to local politics and local municipality, which is something I get asked about a lot, right? How do we think about perhaps the future of public banking and something like complementary currencies that can align with central banks in some better future, but really thinking through that problem of applying MMT principles to more local organizing, and then also, seeing that as not independent or excluded from organizing for federal and macro politics too, right? So seeing municipal and state and federal politics as all part of kind of this nested, interdependent layers of institutions and decision making. So that's something I'm working on. I'm kind of working on some kind of MMT theory of change to respond to critics on the left who kind of have a very, I would say sometimes dogmatic theory of change where it has to be understood on this kind of like conventional Marxist framework. I think there can be some overlap, obviously, but I think we need to kind of upgrade a theory of change that kind of engages more directly with MMT. So that's something I'm thinking about as well. But some of the policy advising work I'm doing has brought me more directly to like housing policy. And I'm like reading about Vienna and what they've accomplished over there, taking those insights and bringing them to what a federal project in the United States to eliminate homelessness and really get housing affordability under control. And the layers of what kind of coordination and administrative capacity is necessary for that, which becomes, again, the central question when you understand that money's not the problem.
It's been so good to catch up with you again, Andrés. We've been speaking with Andrés Bernal, Executive Director of Public Money Action and author of Inflationary Pressures in the Time of COVID-19. MMT is a Theory of Inflation. We'll link to where you can stay current with Andrés and all the work we just talked about in the show notes. But thanks once again for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Andrés Bernal.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.
Sorry for getting all mystical.
No, not at all. Not at all. I've got an Enya album.